So just to introduce myself, my name is Jawad Qureshi. I'm a PhD candidate in the Divinity School. Um, it's an interesting question, an interesting thing that Dr. Padela brings up. He always refers to me as Sheikh Jawad, right? But I don't refer to myself as that in any way, and I don't try to carry myself in that in any way. So it's an interesting question about authority and how you want to construct an authority and how you want to make somebody authoritative or not. Um, I think part of the reason that comes about for Dr. Padela, if you don't mind my interpreting your work, what you're doing there is that there is this traditional training that somebody has, and then that somehow makes somebody a sheikh, which is one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is to see what actual sociological function somebody plays. Do they play the role of a sheikh in their community or not? Are they an actual functional imam? Do they actually functionally answer questions, give guidance or whatever? So it's an interesting problem that we're going to try and bring up a little bit in our presentation today. So I'm a PhD candidate in the Islamic Studies program at the Divinity School. My interest is in the area of Islamic thought. When Dr. Padela started doing a lot of this work related to bioethics, he and I had a lot of conversations, and we've been kind of talking about these things for a while now, for a good long time. So I've been seeing this project from the beginning and seeing it really grow. And alhamdulillah, it's made a lot of progress. There's a lot of interesting things happening. I think this weekend, for those of you guys who are going to stick around for the entire weekend, you're going to see some really great conversations that are going to, I think, are on kind of the cutting edge of what one can do with some of these problems. And you're going to have some of the better minds in the Muslim world and in academia coming together and actually having see these conversations actually taking place. So he talked about towards the end about the stakeholders, who fits in, who's got a voice, and what have you. So my own position in all of this is as a scholar of religion. The secular study of religion that's done in the universities. That's my sociological function. I don't function as a sheikh or imam. I did study a little bit with ulama. Whether that makes somebody a scholar or not is another question. I don't think it does, personally. But, but I did study with scholars, and I continue to study with scholars. But I see my function more as an academic who's trying to give voice to those scholars and also to engage that scholarship as well, and to see that scholarship raise its discourse and maybe even challenge the academy and have the academy fix its discourse too, or alter its discourse in some ways. So, Dr. Padela talked about hybridity and being kind of in a middle ground. We're at the end of the medical college, right across the streets of Divinity School. I think I'm kind of in that zone too, between those two kind of areas. So my interest is in Islamic thought. What I'm going to do today is try and run through some of what he called them the ethical tools, or the tools of ethical thinking in Islamic thought. Many of us might be familiar with some of these, but we might not think about them from the perspective of ethics. And if some of these ideas about Sharia, some of these Sharia concepts are already familiar to you, what might not be familiar is how to think about them from an ethical perspective. What is the ethical challenge that some of these ideas, or how do we think about these from this vantage point? And starting off with, what is ethics? So our objectives are pretty straightforward. We want to understand the broad structure of of Islamic ethical thinking, and we want to put this in conversation with Western ethics and to be exposed to the various trends in Islamic ethics. Okay, so what's ethics? They should be, and I think they put all the content up too, so that's kind of defeats the purpose. But there's a couple of slides that aren't in there, so you might have to jot those down. But yes, the content is there, page 64. So my question to the audience is, what is ethics? We're here at a biomedical ethics conference. What's ethics? Yes. A study of deciding right from wrong. And Hume's notion of what we ought to do instead of what actually happens. How do we feel about that? Study of right and wrong, and what we ought to do instead of what actually happens. Is that, well, we're talking about Muslim Islamic biomedical ethics. Does that work with us? Is there something just right and wrong, or are we good with that? So right and wrong is relative. You can't just say right and wrong. Okay, so how do you get out of that? Okay, so you get out of it by going on a sound Islamic perspective. Does that get us out of this? So you say it's relative and that we can't really do much there, but then somehow a sound Islamic perspective is going to answer this for us? And then I heard over here.
Preferred or less preferred, better or...
So it's not right and wrong.
Shades of gray.
It's shades of gray. Oh, wow. Okay, that's good. If we got shades of gray.
The question is what's
Ethics.
ethical for that situation?
Okay, so
And what is ethical?
so in defining something, you can't have the term in in your definition. So if you ask what is ethics, you can't say what's ethical in the situation. So what is ethics then? But you bring up a good idea here. It's situational. There's some situation that we're trying to define, or get some kind of guidance on. Yeah. Okay, study of, say that again? Values and preferences that guide decision making. That's good. That works too. So it's close to what we had earlier, this idea of right and wrong. Let's stick with that. Right and wrong, decision making, processes, and so on. What disciplines of Islamic learning would we draw on to determine this? To determine what's ethical? Is there an exact transference? So in Islamic thought generally, you can take some disciplines that are kind of universal, and then they have an exact map, an exact replica in Islamic thought. Logic, for example, Greek logic, Aristotelian logic. You have Arabic, Islamic logic, and they basically map over really well. You have a bunch of things like that. Is there one discipline within Islam that actually maps into ethics? Or are there a couple that we might draw on? Oh, so here's us for scriptural ethics. Well, what would that entail? Okay, so our canonical texts, right, our sacred texts, scriptural ethics, Quran and Sunnah, there's a certain degree of right and wrong, morally, ways of thinking there. Okay, what else? Right. So there's, depending on the situation, you might have to draw on different things. So what are those things we draw on? So we mentioned scriptural ethics as one, looking at sacred texts. What else? Some of the obvious ones that we talked about? Yes. So, okay, theological issues. What kind of issues come up in theological ethics? Can I do this or that? Is that theological? Is that creedal? What's the theological ethic? It's actually a big field now. We have a great scholar of that in the Divinity School. What is theological ethics? Creedal ethics. If we don't, we can skip on to another ethic. What else might we draw on for ethics? Fatwa, so that's more fiqh, right? This legal aspect. And so Dr. Patel talked quite a bit about legal ethics. What I'm trying to get at in this little exercise here is that there isn't this one-to-one mapping between ethics as a discipline that you find in Aristotle and Plato and others, and then an Islamic version of it. You actually have to draw, to find the questions that Aristotle and you find in classical ethics texts, you actually have to draw on multiple disciplines within Islamic thought, and not just one. And the same with a lot of disciplines of Islamic learning. The mapping doesn't always happen exactly the same. You've got to look at different areas. So what I want to draw attention is that there isn't actually just one discipline of Islamic thought, of Islamic ethics, but there's actually two kind of dominant modes of doing ethics in Islam. You've got virtue ethics, and then you've got legal ethics. Virtue ethics is, let's pause for a second before we get into this. Most people, like Dr. Patel noted, that when we think of like biomedical issues or new challenges, not even outside of biomedicine, but just modernity and the challenges that it faces, that it poses to Muslims in the realms of science and technology and so on, they immediately want to jump to legal ethics. Is it halal? Is it haram? Right? I need to go to a mufti. I need to find a fatwa that can guide me on this. That's how most people tend to think about ethics, and I think that's pretty accurate. That's how Islamic thinking, Islamic ethical thinking works. There's a big legal component to it, but one that's often lost is the idea of virtue ethics. Right? The idea of virtue ethics, and here when we get into it, the idea of adab. How do you actually carry yourself? So I saw a hand back there.
So I understand the first part of the question to be about disciplinary mapping. But even within, say, disciplinary mapping in a Western tradition,
Right.
Virtue ethics is a kind of
Exactly.
it's not a
Right.
different discipline. So does virtue ethics, is the way you're using it in the second part, have a disciplinary home that is separate from the juridical home of legal ethics?
Right. That's exactly what I'm going to present. Right. That's that point. That there is an adab, that legal ethics and virtue ethics don't always overlap. That there's actually, virtue ethics is its own mode of being ethical. That's not tied to law.
But where disciplinarily does it sit within the tradition?
That's a discipline that they call akhlaq, which we'll get into right here. Right, the idea of Islamic virtue ethics. That's a good jump into there. So Islamic virtue ethics, basically, it draws on, there's one strand of it that comes from Greek thinkers. It's the translation movement that happens in the 2nd, 3rd century of the Hijra, in which you find Aristotle, Plato, and other texts from the Hellenic period, commentaries on those works coming into the Muslim world. And they basically speak about 4 cardinal virtues. You have wisdom and prudence, courage, temperance, and justice. And then these have their corresponding vices, right, the opposite of each one of these. And the main voices that we get here, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, all these kind of great figures who have spoken and articulated Islamic virtue ethics in a Greek tradition, basically taking a lot of what you find from the Greeks and putting an Islamic veneer on it. One of the key figures here is Ibn Miskawayh, the 3rd name. And then Ibn Sina, of course, he's important for us because he's also a great physician and he's a great logician as well. He brings a lot of Greek ideas into the Muslim world. And then you find kind of your big voices of Sunni Islam, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Fakhruddin al-Razi, the great theologians who bring in virtue ethics and give it an Islamic veneer. One of the key terms for virtue ethics, and these are some of the key ones here. Fadila, right? That's a merit or a virtue. And then makarim al-akhlaq, the idea of noble character traits. And this is perhaps the closest that we get to answer your question about a discipline within Islamic teachings that corresponds to ethics. Makarim al-akhlaq. And that just really means noble character traits. And here you find a lot of the authors and a lot of the thinkers who are thinking about character traits drawing on Greek philosophy. The Muslims, however, did not limit themselves to Greek philosophical texts, but in the genre of Makarim al-Akhlaq, they turned to the Prophet. And they saw him, ﷺ, as being the embodiment of all of the virtues. And so they would study the virtues of the Prophet and the companions and those around him. And in this way, they move a little bit away from the Greek heritage and develop their own sense of virtue ethics. One of the key terms, however, is adab. And adab is very difficult to translate. It has a sense of proper conduct, of proper comportment, of right action. The questions that we were being brought up when we were talking about what ethics is, it's right action. But it's the central term for Islamic virtue ethics. Things that are modes of being that are inculcated, that are cultivated, and then that have results in one's actions. Adab, however, it always works in the context of a practice. And the idea of practice here needs to be expanded a little bit. And I got this slide on this, let's see, let me jump ahead to this one here. This definition by Alistair McIntyre, who is a major figure in ethics today, and he tries to revive virtue ethics, and he sees virtue ethics as tied to practices. Every practice has a particular set of ethical virtues that go with it to make it happen, and his definition is worth reading in its entirety and unpacking a little bit. He says, a practice is any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity. Okay, so that's already we're getting quite a bit happening there, through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. That's a really long definition, right? But most of you guys who are involved in medicine already have some sense of what a practice is because you're involved in the practice of medicine itself. So let's ignore his definition for a second, then we'll come back to it. What is the purpose of medicine? What is the purpose of your practice? Is it to make money? Because I know for a lot of people it is. Social status, if you're South Asian, right? If you're from a colonial context, it gets you up in society a little bit. Those are, a lot of people would go into medicine for those reasons, right? My dad was in medicine. My dad went to the University of Chicago Medical School, and he really wanted me to go into medicine too. And I told him, Dad, I'm going to the University of Chicago. He goes, oh, great, I'm in the Divinity School. No, wrong field. So, what's the point of medicine? Yes. To respond to a health need. To respond to a health need. Okay, that works good, yeah? To relieve suffering. Is that unique to medicine, though? What type of suffering? So to relieve some kind of physical suffering. Okay, that's closer now to just medicine, yeah? And to prevent, right? To prevent suffering, too. So it's not just reactionary, it's also preventative, yeah?
Along the same lines, healing and curing.
Healing and curing, particular types of healing and curing, or just general? Okay. But what's the point of, if we want to get a little bit more, like a tighter conception of what the ultimate goal, what the main purpose of medicine, we're circling around it with the idea of healing, preventing illness, preventing types of pain, physical pains, and so on. And what I'm trying to get at is that there's a distinction between what's the internal good of medicine, which is these things that we just mentioned, and what we would call the external good. The external good are all the things that I was talking about first. Getting money, society, moving up in society a little bit because your dad wants you to do it or whatever, right? There's an internal good. And in pursuing that internal good, being focused on that, one can lead, what McIntyre was telling us, a virtuous life. You can lead a virtuous life. That there's a type of good that emerges by seeking that internal good of your practice. It's like, a good way to make this example a little clearer is think about basketball, right? You got people who go into basketball, they just want money, they want the entourage or whatever it might be. And then other people would get into basketball for what? For the love of the game, right? They just do it because they love the game. They love the sport. And by pursuing that sport or whatever that practice is, they're able to lead, by pursuing that excellence, they're able to lead a good life. If we go back a little bit, the second point here is that all practices, whatever it is that you're getting into, have histories, authorities that represent the best standards of that practice. So when you go into medical school, you have to submit yourself to some authority, and they have set the standards of excellence for medicine that you're going to try to achieve, and you're going to actually try to extend those. In order to do that, though, you have to be initiated into a community of practice. You have your fellow physicians that you relate to, not just in the hospital, but nationally and even globally. And it's in that relationship that you have with your fellow physicians, and then also with your patients, and also with yourself. That's where virtues are manifest. That's where the cardinal virtues that we spoke about, that briefly on this previous slide up here, the 4 cardinal virtues of wisdom, prudence, courage, temperance, and justice. That's when those can become manifest. And each practice manifests those virtues in their own way. A basketball player wouldn't manifest courage the same way a physician would. But there's still courage there. A basketball player wouldn't manifest patience the same way a physician would, and so on. In the Islamic world, there is a huge genre of, what happened there? There's a genre of literature that's tied to, and this is the last point on the slide there, that's tied to the adab of various practices. And these texts talk about the virtues that somebody can gain or has to cultivate in order to attain that practice, the goal of that practice, what McIntyre had on that long slide. The one that defines the medical practice of medicine among Muslims is a book by Ishaq ibn Ruhawi called Adab al-Tabib. And what Ruhawi does in his text is actually lay out the standards of excellence that have been attained and the virtues that need to be cultivated in order to attain those standards again. And that in seeking out those virtues, in seeking out those excellence, McIntyre's conception of virtue ethics allows us to think that physicians can lead a good life, a virtuous life. Okay? So one form of ethics is this notion of adab, right? And it's central to Islamic ways of thinking about ethics. It's not tied to legal ethics, it's not tied to theological ethics, it's not tied to scriptural ethics, but it's tied to how people relate to one another and the character traits that one needs to have in doing so, the virtues that one needs to have in doing so. So if we get past this notion of what is a practice, there's these internal goods, external goods. So the external goods, those that are extrinsic to the practice that aren't tied to it, getting money, wealth, fame, and so on and so forth. The internal goods are defined in terms of the practice. You can't attain, there's a type of good that a doctor, a physician will have that I as an academic cannot attain. The good life of a physician, of healing people, preventing illness, curing people, all those things that we talk about, the purpose of the practice, are tied there that I as an academic who teaches, theology or whatever it might be, I can't attain that. And the same is true the other way around, that as an academic, I have goods of my life, seeing students raised and so on and so forth, that a physician might not be able to attain as well. So every practice allows for a form of a good life. And we need virtues to maintain that, to attain that. So another way of thinking about this is that internal goods, where the means and ends are defined in terms of each other, and the external goods are where the means and ends are not defined in terms of each other. So the means of the end of medicine is defined by medicine, whereas the end, if we just say the end of medicine is wealth, fortune, whatever it might be, you can get that doing other things. Okay, if we jump ahead, there's not just virtues that relate to the physician, there's also virtues that relate to illness. And this is an area that most people have not really spoken about. They speak a lot about adab al-tabib, the actual functions of the physician, but for people that get ill, the other side of this, there are also virtues that they can cultivate. And so we find like Quranic references to this. One of them is the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and recognizing through his illness God's oneness, right? Reaffirming God's oneness as a virtue. He says, "He who created me, he guides me, and he gives me food and drink, and when I am ill, it is he who cures me." So having been afflicted with illness, it allows him to cultivate the virtue of recognizing God's oneness of Tawheed, a central Islamic virtue. Similarly, when you think about Prophet Job, Ayub, you have the notion of patience. He too gets afflicted. And remember Ayub, when he cried to his Lord, "Truly the affliction has fallen upon me, yet you remain the most merciful of merciful." So we heard him and removed the affliction that was upon him. And then it says, "Truly we found him full of patience and constancy." How excellent in our service ever did he turn in patience. So remember the 4 cardinal virtues we spoke about? This is, you see, this patience is actually something that you can cultivate through illness. Another example of Mary and the mother of Jesus, not despairing. The Quran says, when the pains of childbirth drove her to the tree trunk and the palm tree, she cried out in her anguish, "Would that I had died before this. Would that I had been a thing forgotten and out of sight." But the voice cried to her from beneath, saying, "Despair not, for your Lord has provided a rivulet beneath you," and it goes on. And so, again, a moment that medical physicians would be more aware with. She's in this moment of pain, of physical pain that we're speaking about, and she is told not to despair. And she has a moment at this point to cultivate this lack of despair, right? Of trusting in God. So, what I want to get at with this is that there are character traits that can be cultivated with every practice. Physicians have to have certain character traits in order to make their practice work. They have to be able to get along with one another. Today we would say that these are, your Hippocratic oath and that kind of thing. That's the version of this, right? Within Islamic thought, this is the adab al-tabib. And that on the other side of this, you have the adab, the proper conduct of the patient. They are able to cultivate particular virtues as well through their illness or whatever it might be. And that through the relationship then between patient and doctor, you can actually see a process where one can encourage the other, usually the doctor to the physician to the patient. Okay, so this is one notion of ethics that doesn't get a lot of press. The only article that I've seen was written by Elizabeth Sartell, who's in the back of the room, and Dr. Padela. It's a short, piece, but more needs to be written on this. Ishaq ibn Rahawi's text, Adab al-Tabib, the proper conduct of the physician, is translated, but more needs to be written about cultivating this aspect of ethics, about developing this aspect of medical ethics. Okay, any questions or comments on this? Yeah. Yeah, and that's one way of thinking of what this adab al-tabib is that those are the best standards of virtues that have been kind of produced or developed or produced in that particular practice. And these adab texts actually try to codify those, that they're sources of ethical thinking that tend to be outside of our purview, because most of us tend to think of ethics in Islam as law or theology. Right? So this is an area that's not been tapped into. And you find adab texts for almost every practice, every social practice in Islamic kind of societies. There's the adab of scholars and students. That's pretty straightforward. There's the adab of the mufti, how they're actually supposed to conduct themselves in giving fatwa. There's the adab of singers. Right? It's not just religious things too. It's the adab of singers, the proper way musicians are supposed to conduct themselves. There's adab al-katib, the way secretaries are supposed to conduct themselves. And it gets a little bit conflated with best practices, but it also, there's always an aspect of it that relates to virtues. Right? And this is a whole area that's not really been studied a lot. You can't find a lot of material on this. Like I said, particularly for medicine, there's a short piece that Elizabeth and Dr. Padela put together in the Journal of Medical Ethics, and that's really about all that I found in Rahawi's translation, the translation of Rahawi's book. Okay. So this is not a particularly Greek form of virtue ethics. It's what you would call an Islamicate. It relates to Muslim civilization. It can derive from Islamic sources, but not necessarily. Muslims saw Galen and the whole world of medicine that they inherited from the Greeks and the Romans, and they said this was fine, and they incorporated it into their civilization. And today, most Muslims, perhaps in the field of medical ethics, might have to look outside of Islamic sources and to actually see, well, where are the standards of practice today? And they'll have to draw outside of Islamic sources for those particular, for newer kind of developments. But the core virtues are going to remain the same. Okay, any other comments on this? Is it clear, this notion of practice and virtue? You can see a little bit, some iffy faces there. Okay, now let's jump ahead to the more kind of meaty stuff that people would perhaps feel a little bit better or more comfortable with thinking about theology and law. Again, here's again another conceptual problem, is that mapping this is not exactly, mapping, again, you can't map it correctly or 100% between law and fiqh. Fiqh has a theological component to it. There is an underlying basis that, to fiqh that is theological in nature. And so I use the term legal theological ethics here to try and draw attention to that. There's discussions that are purely theological, and there's discussions that are kind of in the middle, and then there's those that are purely legal. So the first thing is that legal ethics, this is, you have a series of Islamic disciplines. You get theology, you get kalam, you get usul fiqh, you get fiqh, and then even to a degree, Sufism. The usul fiqh discussions and the theological discussions tend to revolve around how do we determine what is good? Or can the intellect determine what is good? And the legal discussions, the fiqh discussions, tend to say, well, what type of action? They give value to action. Is this action recommended? Is it obligatory? Is it permissible? Is it impermissible? Is it offensive? And then Sufism would be keeping the character of the practice in mind. And some people would conflate Sufism and adab, but those two are kind of independent of each other. So again, we can't find one particular discipline of learning that would map onto ethics within the Islamic scope of disciplines of learning. So we're going to have to draw on a couple of these. One of the key things is that, so historical background, most people could pick this up pretty easily, I think. In theology, we're going to have 4 key schools of thought among the Sunnis. This is a very Sunni presentation here. So we're going to have 4 key schools of thought that exist today, and then we're going to have theologically 2 main strands, and then between the Ash'aris and Maturidis being basically the formers of Sunni orthodoxy, and the Mu'tazilites being kind of a proto-theological school whose ideas still kind of exist amongst Muslims. So this is a very Sunni presentation in particular on these points. But again, you see these are the voices that we're going to have to draw upon. And each one of these is going to map out ethical problems in a different way. So at a theological level, the first kind of challenge we get is Plato's Euthyphro problem, which is, do the gods love what is holy or pious because it is holy, or is what they love holy because they love it? Okay, stated another way, does God command the good because it is good, or is something good because God commands it? All right, so this is kind of the foundational problem at a theological level. What are some answers that we have? Why do we care? Well, how do you determine good or bad then? It's both. So you want to go with the... If one would argue one position, the first one, God commands good because it is good, what's at stake there? What's the problem there? Is there a challenge that this poses? Is there some roadblocks you have to keep in mind? Yes? Right, that this is, that good is independent of God. There's a higher authority beyond God. Not you're playing God, but you're saying that God, there's certain things that are independent of God. Not that I'm playing God per se, but the good is somehow independent of God. Is that clear how that works? Is that if we're saying that God's commanding things because they're good, not because he did, that these things have an existence independent of God. What about the other position? Something is good because God commands it. No problems there? We're all okay? What roadblocks would you happen to emerge? Yeah. So there's some sense that it imposes something on God because it says God has to command good and that he can't command anything else. That's one potential problem there. So if good is only what God commands, man, how do we know what God wants? Here's the question, are you playing God, right? How do you know what God wants then? If the good is what God commands, how do you know what God wants? You know, when I was studying with my sheikh, he would do this a lot. He would ask a question, and he would just keep quiet and wait for someone to give an answer. He'd make his tea, put his sugar in, stir it, and sit, and we'd all be waiting for the answer. And he would say, "Go ahead." So, I don't have my tea, but go ahead. I don't mind the awkward silence. Yeah.
So on that side, then there's the issue of divine voluntariness. So if God commands something that apparently is wrong or evil, how do we know that we should go ahead and do it because that's what we perceive God is?
Right. Is that clear? So that if God's commanding us to do something that looks bad or evil or problematic, how do we know, do we do this or not? Can anyone think of an example, kind of biblically, Quranically, of a ethical problem somebody had where God was told, hey, do this, and the person's like, okay. The sacrifice, right? The binding of Isaac. God tells Abraham, sacrifice your son. And what's Abraham do? Pulls out the knife. Let's go. So for Abraham, what God commands is good. Right? What God commands is good. I had a professor who used to hold up a picture about the yay big of his grandson, big chubby cheeks, look like a pamper ad, and he says, "Would you sacrifice this?" And most of us would say no. Right? I got an 11-month-old at home. I would never allow any harm to come to her. But Abraham is told, sacrifice your son. And he pulls out the knife, takes him to the altar, and he's ready to kill him. In the Islamic version, the Islamic narrative of this, he actually puts his knife on his neck, and God prohibits the knife from cutting him. So it's really graphic, the story. So Abraham says, yeah, what God commands is good. And since God commanded it, I'm going to do it. So here we have a problem for ourselves ethically. Do we do this or not? I mean, I can say, yeah, of course, what God commands is good. What God commands is good. And yeah, I want to do what God commands. I want to be good. But here's the problem. I can't do this. What's another problem that might emerge from this notion that what God commands is good? What else might emerge?
How do you know it is God?
How do you know that God commanded it? What ways would you try to determine that God commanded something? There's a few easy answers on this one. Huh? Yeah, the source that it came from. So you'd go to Scripture, right? You'd go to whatever sources that have the voice of God, apparently, and you would say, well, we can determine good and evil based off of what these texts say. Do the texts cover everything in our lives? I mean, isn't that why we're here, this whole biomedical ethics thing? Because there's ethical problems that we don't find in our texts. So how do you go past our texts then to determine God's will? This is a roadblock that this line of thinking is always going to hit. Is if you say the good is what God commands, well, how do you determine what God's will is? Yeah.
I just thinking within the Maturidi framework, I see the first position as the Mu'tazili framework,
Right.
and the second as the Ash'ari.
Right.
And I don't see the Maturidi point represented here.
Right.
And that would be, it's good because God decides it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is different than
Right. So he's bringing up a good point here that, on this previous slide, I put up a couple of theological schools under Sunni theology, the Mu'tazilites, and then the Ash'aris, and then the Maturidis. And on this slide, the way we divide the question, the first statement represents the Mu'tazili view, that good is independent of God, and good is objective, is knowable. And that the second position represents a version of the Ash'ari view, that good is only what God commands. And the Maturidis, they have a middle ground on this. They say that the intellect can't ascertain what the good is, and it is confirmed by revelation. And it's a nuanced position that doesn't get a lot of press. And a lot of it's because they don't write as much. The Ash'aris have written tons and tons of books. But on this position, there's a nuance that doesn't get a lot of coverage. So turning, what we get then is here, the Mu'tazili answer, good and evil can be determined by the intellect. Good and evil are objectively knowable. This is what they would call natural law. Right? The intellect in and of its own functioning can know what is good and evil. The Ash'aris, however, good and only determined by God, and we get into what's called theological voluntarism. Also, theological subjectivism, and then for our purposes here, divine command. This is a form of ethics that has been talked about quite a bit. The notion that what is good is commanded by God, and it's interestingly enough, Islamic law picks up from this point. So when you determine theologically that the good is what God commands, Islamic law now says, okay, well, how do we determine what God commanded? Whoops, so I don't know what this. So if the good, there we go. It's going to reboot. That's fine. It's okay. Oh, okay. Okay. But the point here is that if we get, what you find happen is that how do you actually then determine what God's will is? The way the Muslims have given the answer, particularly the jurists, is that you know this through revelation. And then you have to determine, okay, well, what are the bounds of revelation? So in Islamic sources, in an Islamic worldview, you'd say you start with the Quran. Obviously, that's the word of God. And then the question is, well, how much of the Quran is actually legal, that deals with legal questions, legal problems? Does anyone have a sense? Not a lot. First of all, how many verses are in the Quran? 6,200, thereabouts, okay? Of those, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali said that only 500 have legal import. Only 500 have legal import. So that's not a huge amount, right? That's not a huge amount. So how do you extend what God's will is? How do you try to find out what God's will is? Here's where Sunni jurists, in particular Shafi'i, one of the early Sunni founders of a law school, he had this argument that the revelation, it's really two sources. It's the Quran and then the life of the Sunnah of the Prophet, the way of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. And that they're of equal status. And that anything else, whether it's the local practices of the people of Medina, which a position that Malik might maintain, or the juristic preference of the preference of a scholar, which the Hanafis might maintain, all of those are not inherently binding. They don't represent the will of God. The lawgiver in Islam, in particularly Islamic law, is God, and the Prophet is a stand-in. He's metaphorically considered a lawgiver. In and of himself, his role is to convey the law. And so that's why he's given the status, his sunnah is given a status equal to the Quran. And from there, Shafi'i eliminated as much as he could, and he wasn't, he's pretty successful to a degree, but he had to, he eliminated non-textual sources. So again, we're doing good then. We've got Quran, which is a limited body of texts. Then we've got Shafi'i, who says the hadith are of equal value. But still, hadith on law, how many hadith are there on law? There's a lot more than 500 verses that you find in the Quran. But even then, we're still stuck with a limited body of problems. The Prophet lives for, alayhi salatu wasalam, his mission is 23 years. And he deals with a whole series of legal issues. But we're kind of stuck 23 years, even within, shortly after his lifetime, there's already new problems that are emerging that people need to figure out how do we extend the law. And so Shafi'i's position then, let's just move ahead. Another problem. Sorry. Okay, yeah, so Shafi'i, so there's different ways of trying to extend the law. The first that almost everybody agrees with is that there's some notion of consensus of the early Muslims. Abu Hanifa and the Kufan school sees the legal rulings of the companions as also having a value in determining law, and the preference of a jurist, meaning a jurist's own opinion on a particular situation. Malik in Medina says that the praxis of the people of Medina, their way of doing things, is also binding legally. And he also has this notion of non-textual sources that can determine the good. Shafi'i rejects all of these. And his position is that the only way you can extend the law is through legal analogy. And this slide's not in your handouts there. So for him, the idea of qiyas is how you extend the law. You have a limited body of Quranic verses, a limited body of hadith, statements of the Prophet, and that you have to develop the law by looking at these three things. You have to see what the rule is, the hukum, and see what type of law what you can derive from that, and the thing that joins the two is the legal cause. So the example that's always given, that most of you guys can probably already think of as well, is the notion of wine, right? What's the legal cause for the prohibition on wine? Is it the grapes? No, because we can have grape juice, right? That's fine. What's the actual legal cause for the prohibition of wine? It's an inebriant, right? It's an intoxicant. And so that's our illah. And so whenever you find a illah, you'll find the same hukum. Whenever you find the legal cause, you will find its rule. And so the ruling on inebriants is that they're prohibited. And so whenever you find anything else that intoxicates, it too will be applied. So they're going to look at the original rule, the derivative rule, and then what joins between them is the illah. The purpose of the jurist is to do these three things. The takhrij al-manat, tankih al-manat, and tahqiq al-manat. These are kind of ways of actually taking the law and extending it there. The first part is to extract the exact legal cause. So when I ask the question, what's the actual cause for wine being prohibited? Is it the grapes? That's determining, okay, well, it's not the grapes, it's something else. That's tahqiq al-manat. You have to extract the exact reason why the law exists, or why the law is there. Tankih al-manat is similar in a sense. It's isolating the actual reason there, right? Here, tahqiq al-manat, this is now ascertaining the presence of a legal cause in an individual case. So when you look at your derivative rule, your particular situation today, you have to determine, well, is that legal cause, is that illah present? So I want to stop for a second here and just connect this to something that Dr. Badale was talking at the end of his talk about the people that have the stakeholders in discussions on biomedical ethics, and whose voice, who's an expert, and what roles they might have. It's at this point that you have kind of a division of duties, where you have the takhrij al-manat, the extracting the legal cause, is the job of the jurist. And at the tahqiq al-manat, ascertaining, is this situation that we have today, this biomedical ethical issue, is that where this rule actually applies? That's where the jurist has to rely on the expertise of the physician. And so here's where you see the two come together. There's kind of a division of duties. The jurist can tell you what the legal cause is, but the application of it, is that what's happening right now? That's where the expert outside of the field of the jurist will have to step in, whether it's medical issues or whatever it might be. Yeah. Where is fitna? Fitra. It wouldn't come into this discussion. It would be in another. It wouldn't come under the discussion of qiyas. Okay, so this is how the law then gets extended. So divine command ethics is one of the things that governs Islamic law, but then we can. It's not the way in which one determines the will of God is through legal analogy. One extends God's will through legal analogy. So if we had the slides off for a second, I wanted to just mention what I'm trying to get is the second point here on this slide. That law is not produced. The jurists don't make law. They aren't saying, "Hey, I'm going to create a fatwa." But the idea is that they're discovering the law. Again, if the good is in the command of God, is what God commands, and it's what God wills, the job of the jurist is to try and figure out what God's will is in a particular situation. So it's not that the jurist creates law, but the jurist tries to discover what God's law is. And so the way they discover it is through the study of textual sources and to determine what the legal cause for a particular rule is. And there's this, the claim is that this is what God wills in a particular situation. And so fiqh, one way of thinking about fiqh is as the disciplined search for the will of God appropriate to a given situation or act. All right? So it's not that they're creating law per se, but there's a claim that they're trying to find the will of God. And so you can see how this is a very theological problem. It's a very theological way of doing it that's tied then to law. Okay. Lastly, I just wanted to finish this because I know Dr. Padel's got more in store for you guys. Right. There's a sense that, actually, let me just jump ahead to this quote here on the slide. Much of this is this way of thinking, divine command ethics, this way that God's will is what determines what's good and bad. The jurists had realized that, when they studied the law as a whole, they had, through induction, determined that the purpose of the law are ultimately 6, or 5, depending on how you'd classify some of these. And one of the key voices to talk about this was Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who spoke about what's called maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of the law. That there's a telos to the law. There's a teleology that the law has. And that the purpose of the law, he says, is, right here, he says, the purpose of the law is 5-fold. The preservation of religion, life, intellect, offspring, and wealth. Whatever entails the preservation of these 5 is a maslaha. Maslaha is a term that can be translated in multiple ways, but in this discussion, I translate it as the good, is good. And whatever dispels these elements is a cause of damage, and you could also use the word harm there, whose repulsion is a maslaha. And so from this notion of the higher objectives of the law, this slogan emerges, that the purpose of the law is to attain that which is beneficial, that which is good, and to deflect or repulse that which is harmful, that which is bad. And that what guides the thinking of the jurist when they're carrying out their legal analogy are these goals, the preservation of these things. This is what is in the mind of the jurist as they are trying to determine what the will of God is, as they proceed in their study. So I want to just conclude here. Let's skip this. So Islamic ethics, you got to draw on a whole series of different disciplines of Islamic learning. The 2 kind of predominant ones that you find when you look at Muslim legal thinking is virtue ethics and legal ethics. Islamic virtue ethics is tied to the notion of a craft, of a practice, where the central concern is adab, right? The central concern is adab. And then Sunni legal ethics is rooted in voluntarism, this divine command notion that the good is determined by God. Divine commands then are extended through a variety of means, in particular legal analogy, sometimes juristic preference, the public good, etc. Lastly, that God's will is purposeful and it points to the human good. And then there's always this tension between scripture-based voluntarism. We have to go back to hadith, we have to go back to the fatwa of early companions, the fatwa of whoever it might be, and this utilitarian notion of, well, can we just determine what's of benefit? And that this is constantly at play in 20th century Muslim ethicists. They're always just, do we go to the higher objectives of the law, or do we simply go with what an existing fatwa might happen to be? And you're going to see quite a bit of that when you read fatwa literature on biomedical ethics. And that's what I had. Sorry for some of the slides kind of threw me off in the logic of it, but if there's any questions, please feel free.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Jawad?